Hello, my name is Marie Laveria, and my YouTube channel is called Living a Simple Life and Finding Your Rhythm LLC. And today I wanted to talk about who invented minimalism. Where does that word come from, minimalism? Did you ever wonder who invented it? Or I'm going to tell you who inspired me to follow this philosophy, but I also wanted to do a little walk down a thread of history. I'm not going to cover everything in the history of minimalism because it's a huge project. It would take me a year to put it together. And I apologize for looking at my notes because I don't have a good memory in memorizing things. But I want to be very clear and as concise as I can what I found. So in this video, I'll talk about some of the entities that influenced the invention of minimalism and talk about some of its development. I don't think it was purposefully invented per se, but I think different ways that people chose to live over the years influenced the development of it in my lifetime anyway. So I'm going to start with who started living the minimalist lifestyle and when. Again, my research is found on the web, and I found a variety of people in different countries with a huge range of time frames to talk about the evolvement of minimalism. And I will say it again, this is not a complete historical study of it. It's just a few things that make sense to me. The practice of minimalism always points to avoiding the unnecessary. It's about simplicity and the belief that less is more. And I really believe that that's my definition of minimalism in a very broad term. The misconception is that minimalists suffer and sacrifice while having less. Less things and less interesting experience, and the opposite is true, because we have the ability to live with less, so we have more time and more freedom and sometimes more money to do interesting things. So just so you know, I'm not offering you a full historical outline. I'm speaking about some threads from the past to the present. I'll begin with my historical findings with monasteries. The disclaimer is that people in monasteries have a very different reason for living with less than people like me, like you, that are not in monasteries. People living in monasteries take a vow of poverty and obedience, and several others. I chose to live simply without vows because I wanted to. But I can't help to think that the monastery life did influence us with what we call minimalism today. Let's start with the 4th century monasteries. They have been part of many religions, including Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, and Christianity. People who live in monasteries either live alone in a community, as hermits, or in a community setting such as monk. And when it's a man, when it's male communities, they're monks in monasteries, and when they're female communities, they're nuns in monasteries. 3 actions that takes place in monasteries is prayer, reading, and manual labor. People take a vow of poverty and own very little. I'll give you an example with Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Everyone's heard of her. And the Missionaries of Charity is what she founded in the 1950s. And each of her sisters owned 3 outfits. They believed that one was to wear, one was to wash, and the other one was to mend. Sandals, because they were mostly in India in warm climate. And if they did go to colder climates, then they had full shoes. They had a crucifix, a rosary, a plate, a fork, a knife, and a spoon, a cloth napkin, a canvas bag, prayer book. And again, in cold countries, they had the proper shoes and the proper clothing, like a coat or a jacket to wear. So that's all they had, and nobody ever held their own money, and they lived in a community setting where they were provided shelter and food. So that's just an example from the 4th century on of this religious living. The Zen philosophy is what influenced non-religious Japanese minimalists. And I don't know when that started, but I'm thinking a long time ago. Japanese minimalism is a concept that focuses on keeping life simple, clean, and uncluttered by living with just the essentials. So in America, in the late 50s and on, I read that musicians and other artists started to create simple art and music, as well as live a simple life with less. They did so willingly and as part of their creativity. This is all I'll share with the history. It's just touching on it very quickly, skimming the top, as you would say. But I want you to know that there is more, a lot more. I'll move on to how I was influenced to be a minimalist. I attended a Roman Catholic school for 10 years as a child, and I was influenced with knowing the religious sisters who taught there. Now, there's a difference between the sisters that taught me school and the nuns in a monastery. The sisters that taught me school lived in a convent, and they had taken a vow of poverty and lived in the community setting, but they were allowed to have hobbies and different items. You know, some of them played musical instruments and they had them. It was their own. And they had different things that they could have and go to different outings, and a lot more, not like monastery, a lot more free to be more like secular, like regular people. So as a child, I believe they influenced me to live with less and live in a simple way. I think this is why when I was 10 years old, I imagined this little cottage in my parents' backyard, and it had just what I needed. And just the thought, when I remember it, makes me feel so warm and fuzzy. I love that little cottage, and I feel like I found it when I found this cottage that I live in right now. So that was the beginning of my influence. They seemed so well taken care of. I lived with parents that were always worried about money, not having enough money to pay the bills, and the sisters didn't really worry about that. You know, they all had jobs. If they were working, you know, they weren't retired, and the Mother Superior got the paycheck and paid all the housing and the food and everything else. So they didn't even have to worry about money. And that really enticed me. So in 2015, two guys created a documentary on minimalism. They refer to themselves as the Minimalists, and they still have, a presence on YouTube, and they've written a few books, and they're quite popular. I saw this documentary a few years later. I was in my late 50s at the time, and this philosophy was very appealing to me. It was the first time that I actually heard the word minimalism, and it was defined for me. And they had some very good points in their documentary, that very first one that they did. I watched this documentary a few times, and it interested me. They included a lot of information on the culture that we're in. Even though it was done in 2015, it still is relevant today. And so now, when I met my friend who owned these tiny cottages that I live in one in southern coastal Maine, when he invited me to live in one, I was ready to do so, because I had been exposed to the thought of living with a lot less, and it really enticed me. So it was like a progression, I guess. I created my own style of decluttering, and I moved at my own pace to move into this little cottage. I was motivated because the cottage I was moving into was across the street from the beach, and I've always dreamt of living close to the ocean. And I knew that the cottage was only 293 square feet, and I also knew that I knew what I could bring in here because I had come to measure. And it took me about, I don't know, I think I said like 6 weeks or so to go through everything I owned in my bigger apartment and sort it out and just bring what I need here. A total of probably 2 months. I went through my stuff 3 times in the process. It takes a while to do the decluttering part, but I guess there's always a framework that's behind us wanting to declutter and to move on to living more simply, and that's a process of it sinking in that that's what we want, being exposed to people and information that causes us to look at it and value it and want to live differently. So thank you for listening. Please consider becoming a member of my channel, and see you next time.